Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen at this end now. Okay. So just a brief introduction, and as I said, we're quite a large group today. So we won't be doing breakout sessions because I don't think that will be feasible for this size of group. But we do welcome questions and comments in the chat. So please feel free to pop your questions in. And I've got a couple of pause points built in to the presentation, so we'll stop to have an opportunity to answer a few questions. My colleague's with me as well, so he'll be keeping an eye on the chat too and be able to respond to some of the questions or flag them up at certain points. So just to introduce myself, I'm co-lead with Dewis Choice. We're based at the Centre for Age, Gender and Social Justice at Aberystwyth University. My background is that I'm an accredited independent domestic violence advisor and sexual violence advisor. My background is solely working with domestic abuse victims who are in later life, so 60 years and over. And when I first joined Dewis Choice, I worked as a wellbeing practitioner, so going out delivering a face-to-face service with older victims and their family members and friends. I'm joined by David, and David is currently our area wellbeing lead. So he has responsibility for managing the Dewis Choice service. So a little bit of background about what Dewis Choice is. So we're a research initiative. As I said, we're based at Aberystwyth University in Wales. We were established in 2015. And the initiative's quite unique, really, in that it combines a longitudinal research study with a co-produced specialist support service for older female, male, and non-binary victim survivors of domestic abuse. So these are people who are experiencing domestic abuse from intimate partners and adult family members. So we are quite unusual in that the design of the service was co-produced with groups of older people. So we went out into communities, we formed design groups, and we really looked at what older people wanted if they were referred into a domestic abuse support service. What came through quite clearly was around the language that we used when responding to older people. So some were comfortable with the terminology of domestic abuse and perpetration, whilst others weren't. So hence our workers were called choice support workers and choice wellbeing workers. Originally, we had thought they would be choice justice workers, but this was felt that it might actually be a bit intimidating to our victim survivors when they first came in. So we really did quite a bit of work with older people, seeing what felt acceptable and comfortable for them and what would lead to maximum engagement for them with a support service. The way our research works is that we have older people in that we support via referral only. When they're referred in, they are told that we are a research group as well as a support service. There's no obligation to engage with the research for clients coming in for support with us, but if they choose to do so, they can meet with researchers and share their lived experiences of domestic abuse, but also their experiences of help seeking, their experiences of engaging with services, what looks like a good service response and what doesn't look like a very positive service response, and to evaluate the service that they get from our service team as well. So they're provided with support. Initially, we felt that the support would be up to 18 months, which we're aware is a considerably long time compared to other domestic abuse support services for younger age groups. We were quite surprised, really, that we've had people in for support for a lot longer than 18 months. So the longest period has been 4 years for a female who'd had abuse across a 40+ year marriage and was dealing with the aftermath of that with divorce, with PTSD and a lot of complex issues and needed that long-term support in her recovery and rebuilding confidence. Today we are going to be focusing more on adult family violence victims. So parts of this presentation will cross over both groups, so that you will hear some of the experiences of our older IPV victim survivors, but also primarily our older adult family abuse survivors. So we're going to be discussing, as I said, domestic abuse. We'll be listening to some excerpts of victim survivor stories that were featured in our podcast, and we'll be looking at an anonymised case study as well. So if you do feel you need to take some time out at any point, please feel free to do so. We know domestic abuse is a far-reaching phenomenon. It affects a lot of people's lives, but also it can be quite emotive listening to some of these stories and experiences as well. So please do prioritize your own well-being throughout the presentation, and if you do need to step out, please feel free to do so. So the aim of today is really to increase understanding around adult family abuse that affects older people. We're going to be aiming to identify perpetrator behaviour in adult family abuse against older victims, identify some of the barriers for help seeking for older victims of adult family abuse, but also to develop some knowledge and skills around responding to adult family abuse. So to give you a bit of a background on where our research started, really. So we've been going with the Dewis Choice initiative since 2015, but there was a lot of research carried out at the centre prior to 2015 that led to the launch of Dewis Choice. And this really looked at research into domestic abuse in later life and found that older victims experience systemic ageism. And through this, very little was known about their experiences of domestic abuse. So we found that there was limited research. There were huge gaps really in the research on this age group. So limited research on their experiences of domestic abuse, and the abuse was often framed under the umbrella term of elder abuse. So it appeared that once you reached 50, which I'm sure there's quite a few people on the call who were over 50 years of age, but once you reached the age of 50, you were directed away from a domestic abuse response, and many of the access to criminal and civil justice that went along with that, but also that safety and recovery support as well. So it really sat under this umbrella term of elder abuse, and that was alongside abuse from non-family members and partners. So it was sitting with institutional abuse. Very much of it was interpreted as being financial only. Um, that really has not been the case in our research with older people, where we've been finding that we do get referrals in that have a lot of financial and economic abuse in them, but it's rarely financial and economic in isolation. So quite often financial abuse is just a feature of a pattern of other abusive behaviours. So this framing domestic abuse in older people and elder abuse have the effect of homogenizing older people. And when we're thinking of older people, just from our service, starting from 60 plus, you're looking at people with a diverse from a diverse group and with an age span of well over 40 years and very different experiences and needs. So within that, we're looking at males, females, we're looking at people who were teenagers in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So people who've had very different historical backgrounds, family backgrounds, ethnic and cultural, and sexuality as well. So there was significant gaps also in data collection around this group. So until 2017, the Crime Survey for England and Wales only collected domestic abuse data for victims aged 16 to 59 years. So really, you just sort of fell off once you reached 60 years. The age gap was raised to 74 in 2017. And the first few years of recording showed that around 280,000 people aged 60 to 74 experienced domestic abuse. So that was for the year ending 2020. The reason for this cap on data collection for the crime survey was because it was deemed that an older person filling out the survey on their own, on a digital system, would not be able to navigate scrolling up the screen to answer all the questions. And because the domestic abuse section of the crime survey is self-filled in, you're not filling that in with support from a researcher. It was deemed that older people wouldn't be able to navigate the system. So again, we're seeing ageism coming in really in that data collection method. The upper age cap has now been removed. There was a delay in collecting data for the 75-year plus age group. And this was due to that coinciding with COVID and it not being safe actually to deliver a domestic abuse survey throughout COVID. So we're just about to get our second year of data for the older age group. Having said that, the first year is not particularly useful. It involves quite small numbers in the data sample, and they're not very well disaggregating, so they're not really telling us a lot at the moment. It's really important, really, when we look at those cut-offs with age limits, because a large number of Dewis Choice referrals have been for individuals aged 75 to 85 years. So they wouldn't have been captured in these previous surveys. So it's not surprising, really, looking at that lack of research and lack of data, that there are huge gaps in service provision. Domestic abuse assessment tools and service responses have been developed based on that research around younger groups. So really based on younger victims of intimate partner abuse, mainly on female younger victims. There's been much more research in later years around the children of domestic abuse victims, but again, very little around older victims, and particularly older victims of abuse from adult family members. So I think an example of one of the issues with this is our domestic abuse, stalking and honour-based violence assessment tool. So many of you are probably familiar with that. We shorten that to the DASH. Was designed solely on research based on younger victims of intimate partner violence only. So it doesn't really include older victims and their experiences, and it doesn't really include adult family violence to an extent there. So it's problematic, really, in terms of how we're assessing the risk of older victims. The lack of research and data collection has meant also there's very little evidence base to inform needs assessments for commissioning of specialist service for older victim survivors as well. So this has really led to a lack of visibility and a lack of recognition of older people as victim survivors of domestic abuse, both within service provision and in the media. So we're starting to see a little bit of an increase in media coverage of older victim survivors, but it's still quite minimal. And an example here really is if we look at Safe Lives Insight data for 2016, so that's looking at MARAC provision for high-risk victim survivors. They found that only 3% of older victim survivors accessed IDVA services supported by the MARAC model. So very few older victims were coming through into those high-risk domestic abuse services. So it's also this lack of researchers' data has contributed to a lack of understanding around older people as victims of abuse from adult family members, and again framed under that elder abuse banner. So just a bit of a reminder, really, of what the definition of domestic abuse is. So we've got our first statutory cross-party definition now in 2021 for England and Wales. And it defines domestic abuse as a single incident or course of conduct between those who are aged 16 years or over, And to come into that category for it to be domestic abuse, they need to be either intimate partners, ex-intimate partners, or family members. Under the ranges of abuse there, domestic abuse can be physical, sexual, economic, emotional, psychological, and controlling or coercive behavior. And our understanding is increasing around coercive control, and the many situations of domestic abuse do involve an element of controlling and coercive behavior. So there's increased awareness amongst those responding to domestic abuse that it is rarely a one-off incident. It often consists of one or more type of abuse. We know many victim survivors will experience post-separation violence, and that separation is one of the most dangerous points. As we've seen with our older victim group, one of the most dangerous parts of the relationship we're seeing coming through is not just around that separation, but also in later life, where we see an older perpetrator fearing that they've lost control of their victim. So it may be that the older perpetrator has developed illness, or the victim has developed illness or disability, or both. So there's been little research on abuse involving older victims and perpetrators and abuse by adult family members, but even less around some of the other groups in later life with different intersectional needs. So people who are LGBTQ plus, those with disabilities, and those who have care and support needs. Okay, so if we're focusing down on adult family violence, what do we mean by adult family violence? So it is domestic abuse as defined by the statutory definition. The perpetrator and victim, as I said, are aged 16 years or over. There's quite an extensive list. You can see them on the slide, and I'm not going to read through them all, but you will have the slides available afterwards. But it's a relative as defined by the Family Law Act for 1996. So it's quite an extensive list of relationships. And the majority of those you see on the slide, we will have seen at some point in our service provision at Dewis Choice. So for older victims experiencing abuse in a range of family relationships where the abuse has been identified, as I said, it has traditionally sat under that umbrella of elder abuse, but any relationship that meets the definition in the Family Law Act will fall within the definition of domestic abuse. And we've seen with our safeguarding statistics in Wales that they're not very well defined as domestic abuse in our safeguarding stats. But adult family violence also falls within the scope of the crime of coercive or controlling behaviour. It also applies to domestic violence protection orders and to non-molestation orders and occupation orders, which can be used to remove an adult family perpetrator from an older victim's home. And all of these methods of putting in protection and removing a perpetrator are very underused when it comes to the older victim group, particularly with adult family violence. So we know domestic abuse will affect approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men across their lifetime. And domestic abuse has more repeat victims than any other crime. So on average, there will have been 35 assaults before a victim calls the police. On average, police in England and Wales receive over 100 calls relating to domestic abuse every hour, yet it's significantly underreported. And it's estimated that only 18% of women who experienced domestic abuse in 2018 reported this to the police. So given our gaps in data, what do we know about the prevalence of domestic abuse amongst older adults? Well, in 2021, in the census, over 24.4% of the population of England and Wales were aged 60 years and over, so quite a significant portion. And looking at the crime survey for England and Wales, 5.5% of adults aged 16 to 74 years of age, so 2.3 million adults experienced domestic abuse. And as I said earlier, 280,000 of those were identified as age 60 to 74. Domestic abuse is experienced by 14.75% of women with a disability and 7.5% of men with a disability. And this compares to 6% of women and 3.2% of men without a disability. So you're more than twice as likely to experience domestic abuse if you have a disability. And it's putting that in the context of later life and domestic abuse. It's estimated that 40% of people aged 60 years and over have a disability that affects daily life. So when we look at those two statistics together, again, there's an increased rate of domestic abuse in individuals with disability, and we've got higher rates of disability in later life. It's something that has come through as quite a theme in our service provision, that we do have high rates of disability in our client group, and this is often targeted through the domestic abuse that they're experiencing, or the domestic abuse impact is exacerbated by the disability. So in England and Wales, there were 362 domestic homicides in the 2 years combined period from March 2018 to March 2020. And of those, 260 people were killed by a partner or ex-partner, and 97 were killed by an adult family member. So as we can see there, adult family homicide is quite high, probably higher than we would expect, because we tend to think of domestic homicides as being within that intimate partner relationship. Current data shows that 27% of domestic homicides in England and Wales now involve a victim aged 60 years and over. That has been increasing. There's been an increase over COVID, but there was a year-on-year increase prior to COVID. So it's something that we're seeing more and more. We're not clear whether the amount of homicide is increasing or whether the identification of older victims as victims of domestic homicide is increasing. So between the year March 2018 and the year 2020, the highest proportion of domestic homicides per head of population, so that's per age group, were aged 70 years and over. So people aged 70 years and over accounted for 18% of all victims of domestic homicide. So research into the impact and restrictions during COVID did show, as I said, that there was an increase. There was an increase in the percentage of adult family homicides of those who were aged 66 years and over. So this went up from 35 to 43%, with 63% of victims aged 55 years and over. In contrast to when we look at intimate partner homicide, then the adult family homicide cases, the perpetrators had higher rates of mental ill health and recorded drug and alcohol use, but were less likely to be known to police for a history of domestic violence than in the younger perpetrator group and in the intimate partner perpetrator group. So again, this is something that we've seen evidence through our research with our clients in our service. A common theme in the adult family domestic homicides was that the older person was a caregiver for the perpetrator. So they were providing some form of care for their adult family member. So to date, the Dewis Choice initiative has provided intensive support for over 200 older people and their family members. Just under a third of referrals were males. So we had 31% of males come into service and 69% of females. Again, this is quite unusual when compared to the younger age group. The youngest client that we supported was 58. We had a specialist project looking at dementia and domestic abuse, and we had a lower age threshold for intake of 55 for cases involving dementia. Our eldest client was a 93-year-old female, and she was experiencing physical and financial abuse from an adult child. Over 2/3 of our referrals are aged 75 years and over, so we're seeing the sort of older age group. 44% of referrals involved abuse from a current intimate partner and 40% abuse from an adult family member. So this is over the past 3-year period. We are seeing an increase at the moment in referrals involving adult family abuse. So that percentage is going to sort of rise a bit higher. A small number of cases involved abuse from both. So we did have cases where people had experienced abuse from an intimate partner and an adult family member, either consecutively or concurrently. More than half of our referrals had a disability, and the majority of these were physical and affected mobility. And dementia is a feature in 20% of our referrals, so either with the victim survivor or the perpetrator. So looking at the complexity that we see in later life, and with the exception of a small number of cases, our referrals all fall within the definition of domestic abuse. So there are added complexities related to the age of victims that we work with and the age of some of our perpetrators too. And these include disability, physical and mental ill health, including degenerative conditions and terminal conditions in some cases, limited access to housing and finances, limited awareness around rights and entitlements too, care dynamics between victim and perpetrator. In some cases with our IPV cases, we've seen really long duration of abuse. So I think the longest has been 60 years plus. And this length of abuse and also the extreme emotional impact of abuse from adult family perpetrators as well can lead to significant impact on both physical health and trauma in later life. Um, we see high levels of isolation and the added complexities of abuse perpetrated by adult family member, particularly children and grandchildren, and high levels of substance use and mental ill health in our adult family perpetrator group. So that really parallels what we're learning from adult family homicide. So looking across this last 3-year period up to November 2023, the gender of perpetrators across the combined IPV and adult family sample is 76% male and 24% female. So we've got quite a high number of female perpetration within that. The majority of those are situated within our adult family sample. The frequency and severity of physical violence varied in both the intimate partner and adult family violence sample, with standard high-risk behaviours identified across both groups. So it's probably surprisingly, high-risk perpetration was identified in both the intimate partner and adult family violence female perpetrator group. Examples of this include assault with a knife in the intimate partner sample, but we also had instances of non-fatal strangulation and attempted starvation in the adult family sample that were perpetrated by female adult family members. In the non-fatal strangulation case, this was an adult daughter, and then we've had a couple of cases of attempted starvation which have involved adult grandchildren. So the youngest perpetrator in the adult family sample was a grandson, and he was aged 18 years of age. And the oldest, which might come a little bit surprising to you, was a mother actually who was in her 80s, and she was abusive towards her daughter who was in her 60s. So both of them sort of came in within our age demographic at the service. Um, as the chart shows, a larger number of adult family perpetrators were adult sons, with a smaller number being daughters. There was also evidence of dual perpetration in a small number of cases. So we did have the partners of adult children and grandchildren who were abusive alongside the adult family member. So there can be a misconception that risk reduces with age, and this is something that we hear all the time, particularly around older perpetrators.
I think you're on
You're
mute.
muted.
Oh, I don't know how I got muted. Have I been muted for very long?
About 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's only
Oh,
just gone muted for some reason, Elise.
oh, okay. I didn't touch my clicker either because I didn't because I always stop stuff. So maybe I've got muted as part of the group. I'm okay to start this slide, aren't I? We haven't missed anything off of this one, the slide
No,
before.
no.
Okay. So sorry, I will start at the beginning of this slide. So apologies if you've heard part of this as well. So, yeah, I was just coming on to looking at the types of abuse and the risk. So there can be a misconception that risk reduces with age. Our client groups actually do experience the same forms of abuse and range of severity as younger victim survivors. In some cases, what might be viewed as less less extreme forms of physical violence can actually cause a more serious injury in our older age group. I know many of you on the call today work with older people and are quite aware of the sort of conditions in later life and higher levels of sort of frailty in later life as well. So a push or a shove that a younger person could withstand without a significant injury could even be fatal to an older victim. So abuse in later life is not always as easy to identify. The signs can be disguised by age-related factors such as declining health. We see all of the forms of physical, financial, economic, psychological, and emotional abuse that you can see on the slide in both our intimate partner and adult family violence sample. The one area of abuse we haven't seen evidence really in our adult family violence sample is the sexual abuse. And I don't want to give the impression that sexual abuse from adult family members doesn't happen, because we know that it does, and we know from our links with other services, particularly sexual violence services, that this does happen from adult family members in later life, but it's not something that we've really seen evidenced in our victim survivor group. So in terms of physical abuse, there may be visible signs of injury from an assault, but the signs can be more subtle and they can include behaviours that are not so easy to identify as abuse, but they can present as poor care, but cause physical harm. So these can include the misuse of medication, poorly managed medical conditions, neglectful behaviour, including leaving somebody in a room that's too cold, withholding food, as we've seen at the extreme levels of that. We've seen attempts at starvation, withholding mobility aids and limiting mobility or causing to fall. So we've seen quite a lot of examples of abuse that's accompanied with sort of hoarding type behavior. Also stacking items up to make navigating rooms within the home really difficult for that older person to sort of barricade them out of rooms, literally in some cases. Um, and we've seen a lot of financial and economic abuse, and this can include direct theft or theft by using a person's identity to borrow money, run up debts, or buy goods without their permission. So examples of economic and financial abuse that we've seen from adult family perpetrators include controlling the finances and denying the older person access to their own money and financial information. This quite often goes into the hundreds of thousands with some of our victim survivors. So, particularly if they've sold property and moved in with an adult family member, and the control of the bank account has gone over with the digital banking to the adult family member, and that money's gone. Borrowing money and not paying it back, exaggerating the older person's care needs to increase benefits, going shopping for the older person and buying shopping for themselves without their permission, or drawing out cash that they weren't permitted to do and pocketing the extra money. Giving somebody an allowance or pocket money, that's something we've seen quite commonly where an adult family member has control over the finances and they're only giving that older person a very small amount of their own money weekly. and in some cases, misuse of financial power of attorney as well. But as I've said, financial abuse often overlaps with other types of abuse, and it quite often involves a level of either coercion or emotional abuse to access those financial resources. Economic abuse can cause isolation. So if the older person's access to the money is limited, it limits their ability to travel and engage with social groups as well. But it also really infantilizes older people and can cause quite a significant loss of autonomy and independence. We have seen examples of exerting pressure on an older person to sign over property and financial assets as well, or to appoint a power of attorney. Um, We've had a few examples of older people selling up and using the money from the property sale to pay for an extension on the home of the family member on the understanding that they'll be able to live there for the rest of their lives, but with no legal agreement in place on that money. So it being really deemed as a gift to the adult family child. And then when the abuse starts in those relationships, if they flee the abuse, then essentially they've lost their home and their access to their life assets as well. So, in terms of psychological and emotional abuse, this can include verbally abusing somebody and saying things to undermine their confidence and self esteem. And for an older person, this is often directly targeted at their age. So it's designed to humiliate by suggesting that they lack capacity, are a burden, are no longer of any use. Emotional abuse can be used to further exert control by making the older person doubt their own capability to carry out actions for themselves. So again, it's that undermining of autonomy and independence. As I said, the form of sexual abuse listed, we've only really seen those in our intimate partner sample, but we would not want to give the impression that this doesn't take place in adult family abuse. As I say, we are aware that it does. So, as I said, they can experience the same forms of abuse as younger victims, and this includes coercive control. A couple of quotes on the slide there sort of mention coercive control experienced by an older male and an older female. And most of our knowledge around coercive control, alongside with our general knowledge of domestic abuse, again, is based on that research into younger heterosexual intimate relationships. But our research has strongly evidenced that there have been high levels of coercive control that feature in intimate partner and adult family member abuse in later life. But again, this can be masked by age related factors. So it really undermines as I said, that autonomy, and it can leave an older person feeling de-skilled and lacking the confidence they feel to independently navigate the more modern world. And this can prevent a significant barrier to leaving because they're given the impression that they don't have the skills to manage living independently on their own. For older survivors in heterosexual relationships, coercive control can be masked by those historic gender norms and those sort of power dynamics that have sort of been reinforced really by, the breadwinner model really for years. But in younger relationships, we would see these potential power balances as as not quite right, and we'd be questioning them. And we need to apply that lens to older people, but also apply that to adult family relationships. So we have become quite accustomed to younger adult family members becoming in a supportive, almost a parental role for some of our older people, and it seems to be something that's sort of an accepted norm throughout society that we wouldn't be so accepting of if we were looking at a younger person with a family member or an intimate partner. So this particularly played out in relationships with a care dynamic. So it's looking at whether both of those parties have control and independence over how they either deliver or receive care, or does one person lead all the conversations and acts as the voice of the individual, and that voice of the older person is lost. So some of the behaviors we've seen from adult family members to increase control and feelings of dependency include constantly criticizing, humiliation, abuse related to faith. So we've seen restrictions on being able to take part in faith practices, controlling and monitoring daily activities, controlling and hindering access to independent communication forms, preventing a victim in some cases from learning languages or making friends outside of ethnic or cultural backgrounds, preventing accesses to services that can offer support, particularly the health and care sector, and using threats to pets as well. So, coercive or controlling behaviour is an offence now under the Serious Crime Act, and this has been amended under the Domestic Abuse Act to also include ex-partners and family members who don't live with the victim. So prior to this, if it was a family member who was, say, visiting regularly and was abusive and controlling, the coercive control legislation wouldn't have captured that, but it's now been extended, so it does now capture those relationships. So again, very significant for adult family abuse in the older age group. Okay, so I'm going to just pause briefly just to answer any questions. I don't know if there's anything coming up in the chat there, David, that you want to flag up.
Hi, Elize. Yeah, an interesting question's come up. I'm just looking for it again now. Does your organisation support prosecution? Also, in my experience, it is often very difficult to prove. How do you stop the abuse if it can't be proven? For example, turning off the heat without withholding food or using their bank card to pay for their own shopping, especially if someone has dementia and cannot recognise this themselves.
Yeah. If I address the prosecution question first, yes, we do. We found that, and this is research prior to us, and our own research here has shown that there was a lack of explanation and offer of criminal and civil justice options when it was an older victim. So quite often it was a paternalistic approach that really welfareized that older person. So it looked at their immediate risks to physical safety and it looked at their health needs as well. So there was very little focus on the perpetrator as well and on their behavior and what could be done about that. There was an assumption that older people would not withstand well going through a criminal justice system, but also that they would not choose that. Um, We've found that that's been very mixed within our client group. And we always explain what criminal and civil justice options are available to them, and we will support them to report and go through with those, in some cases helping to evidence gather for police as well when prosecutions are going through, for example, for fraudulent behavior by adult family members. We have helped with sort of going in for banking appointments, going through accounts and identifying some of those as part of a multi-agency safeguarding approach to take some of these cases forward. We have had older victim survivors who've reported physical violence and have gone through with prosecutions there. There's been more reluctance to go through with reporting and criminal prosecutions in our adult family violence group. Having said that, that can come sort of quite later down the line. So quite often when we're first having contact with somebody, they're like, no, I don't want to do that. Don't want to criminalize them. But with support over a longer period, we found that we always reintroduce those options. So we never take it as read that somebody's decision a few months ago will be the same as it is, a few months later. And quite often with support and confidence, they will revisit those decisions. And we have had a few examples of them reporting to the police, reporting financial abuse, reporting physical threats and assaults, and also taking some civil routes as well to remove adult family members from their home. So we do support those, and I think it is always important that we explain those to older victim and what that actually means to be going through those processes and what that looks like. Sorry, there was something about the mental capacity in there, wasn't there?
Yeah, hi. That was me asking the question. It was the what I struggle with is, say if someone lacks capacity in that regard and they're unable to kind of recognize the abuse, they can't remember it, but say other family members know what's going on, but
Yeah, yeah,
it's very difficult to prove it to the outside world, if you know what I mean. If it's really small things like someone's going in and turning off the heat, or they're purposely leaving gone off food in the fridge, or removing the food so they've got nothing to eat, or I don't know, trying to mm, make it seem as if this person doesn't have support needs, so that they're not spending any money on care, for that person's financial gain, as in their inheritance, those
yeah.
kind of things. I find it very difficult to kind of prove that.
Yeah, it is. It is difficult, and these are some of the most complex cases that we have come in. We do work with cases where we've got a victim survivor with dementia, and in some cases, quite advanced loss of
Mm.
capacity in a lot of their decision-making areas. This is going to sound terrible. It's almost easier to work with the ones that are much further down the line in terms of their loss of capacity, because then there's very clear safeguarding routes and actions are being taken, and that decision making has been taken out of their hands. In those earlier stages where the capacity is beginning to sort of have issues, and there's a little bit of lack of understanding, a bit of forgetfulness coming in, it is really difficult, like you say, to be able to evidence those cases. I will point you to, on our website, we've got a dementia tool, the coexistence of dementia and domestic abuse, which we've developed through working with our clients with dementia and working with our partners in adult safeguarding. I will say the multi-agency responses where we've got a domestic abuse response and a safeguarding responses are the ones that have had the most effective outcomes, because our safeguarding professionals have a bit more clout and a bit more ability to be able to access that older person than we do. But then they'll draw on our domestic abuse expertise in terms of looking at whether those behaviours are remiss and poor care, or whether they're actually directly patterns of abuse. So we have had some effectiveness in working with an older person where we've been able to spend time with them and gather all those bits that have put together a pattern of abuse to take that forward with adult safeguarding. But as you've said, the most difficult cases for us to access have been the ones where we've had calls from adult family members saying, I can no longer access my mum because brother or sister has got mum in the property. They're delivering all their care. They're not allowing anybody in. And I would say that they are the cases that we've found most hard to get a solution for, particularly as we haven't been able to access that older person to meet with them. What we do try and do is work with as many people who are having contact with that older person as possible. So particularly health can be a route in there, and working closely with GPs, community nurses, any routes that they're accessing health for. It's got quite a key role to play with there. But I'd love to have a really good answer for you on that. But that's one we've struggled with, and one that I've been asked 3 times over the last week. So you're not alone in struggling with that.
The other thing is, what areas do you cover? Do you just
We
cover Wales?
we work in one small area in Wales, so we cover, well, it's a small area. We cover the whole of Carmarthenshire, so it is quite a big rural area. We're very fortunate in that we have a specific adult safeguarding team positioned in Carmarthenshire as well that we work very closely with. Our referrals come in from adult safeguarding, police, health, third sector, domestic abuse services, other older charitable organisations working with older people. They also come in from our high risk IDVA team as well. So if cases are coming into Marek that involve an older person, then generally they'll refer that case down to us. So we'll work with the IDVA for a period of time and then take that case over into service with us. With our dementia work for our first few years, we didn't get any dementia referrals, even though we were open to them, but we had a specific project around dementia in 2019 funded by Comic Relief. So you will find the resources for that and some more information about that on our website. So please do go and have a look at that. Everything on the website's free to download.
Sorry, I've just got one more question and then I'll shut
That's
up.
okay.
But is there an equivalent service in different areas throughout the UK, or is this like specific to your area?
We are specific in terms that we are the only one of our kind that does this longitudinal support with the research in place. Having said that, we partnered with Safe Lives to deliver OPFA training, which trained IDVAs across the UK to work with older age groups. So we delivered a lot of training there, but we've also trained just coming up to 23,000 people now across the UK. So we are seeing a rise in older people's specialist domestic abuse workers and specialist IDVAs cropping up now across different parts of the UK. So it's worth seeking them out. There's a particular speciality coming through in IDVAs that are working in hospitals as well, and they're getting quite upskilled around responding to older people. So although there isn't an equivalent service like ours, the learning is spreading and it's coming up in pockets, but normally with one specialist worker in a service rather than a complete service. So they are coming through, but it's a slow burn, but it is improving.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks very much.
No, thank you.
Just one more quick question, Elize. Laura picked up on you talking about legislation was available to remove a perpetrator from the home and was asking if it was a non-molestation order.
Yes. If you're going through a civil route, you can use a non-molestation order, which the non-molestation order restricts access to an individual. So if they don't have a right to be in that home, it will also cover, because it's the victim survivor's home, it will also cover that through the non-molestation order, with them not being able to enter the home, approach the person, or it depends which restrictions you put on when you're applying for that. But they can be quite specific and quite expansive. If you're looking at getting somebody out of that person's home, so if you've got two people living together in a home, then you partner the non-molestation order with an occupation order, and there's a balance of harm that's used to decide whether the balance of harm to that victim of having that person in their home outweighs the balance of harm to making a person homeless and removing them from their home. So it is a bit tricky to apply for, but we have had some success, haven't we, in a couple of cases with getting the occupation orders as well. So I hope that helps. In terms of criminal sanctions, obviously there's a range of sanctions that come along with bail conditions and restraining orders and things like that that sit along criminal processes as well. Okay, I'm going to move along. So we've sort of touched on some of the barriers already, but a lot of these barriers, we tend to think of older people in terms of their own very individual internal barriers to seeking help and support, but these barriers can also be institutional and organisational. So in terms of individual barriers, these can include fear of repercussion from the perpetrator if they disclose. So those fears that are there in a younger victim group too. Fear of repercussion from family and community as well. So there can be a lot of fear of how they'll be judged, particularly if they're reporting abuse by an adult child as well, and there's those fears around how the rest of the family or the community are going to view them as a parent or a grandparent. There's also not recognising the behaviour as domestic abuse, and this can create real uncertainty over where and how to disclose, because a lot of older people don't have that language to say, you know, I'm being abused or I'm experiencing domestic abuse. They may also be dependent on the perpetrator, either financially for care and support, or have a lack of knowledge over their rights and entitlements as well. So many of our older people we work with are not aware of their right to access local authority housing, and also to access that as a victim of domestic abuse, which gives them, priority over housing as well and pushes them up the list. And there's a lack of awareness around that. There's a lot of self-blame and shame as well. And we're working with people who've got very poor self-esteem and in some cases really poor mental health. And again, that can make their situation feel impossible as well to escape. But if we look at some of the institutional barriers, there are a lot of myths and stereotypes that an older person won't want to leave or make changes. We've found that once the options are explained and that intensive support is in place, we do see older victims of intimate partner abuse leave. We saw a lady leave and seek a divorce after 60+ years. But we've also seen in the adult family group that they do choose to remove the abusive adult family member from their home. But this is not something that happens in the first few months when we're supporting. It's quite often 6 months plus down the line before they build the confidence to do that. Or they will seek housing and leave the home of an adult family member as well. In terms of housing, again, that's really difficult. There's a lack of accommodation for that meets older people's needs in terms of emergency accommodation and follow-on accommodation as well. So that is something we found a barrier, particularly during COVID when we had older victims attempting to flee and we had difficulty finding accommodation for them. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm aware time's ticking away and I want to cover some of the other slides here. But I will say what another issue we've had in terms of accommodation, which is a really common theme in our older age group, is that a lot of older people's accommodation doesn't allow pets. And our clients have said, I would rather stay and continue with living in this situation with the abuse than actually part with my pet. So we can't really underestimate the role that pets play, particularly as they're sometimes, one of our victims described it as our only friend, and had been a significant emotional support for us. So we will sort of try and flag that up. Although housing don't always offer accommodation that would take pets, that can be a key barrier to an older person leaving. So in terms of sort of how they're affected, specific to adult family abuse, some of the barriers can be not recognizing the behavior as abuse, minimizing or excusing the behavior, particularly when there's a mental health illness or there's substance misuse by the adult family member. Feelings of embarrassment, shame, and self-blame, and fear, as I've said, of reporting to the police and how they'll be viewed if they're criminalising that adult family member. But these can be overcome over time. We've found that survivors are more likely to seek help for their abusive adult family member than they are for themselves, particularly if there is a mental health need or a substance use. And we have found quite an effective strategy in tackling some of these complex cases is to bring on board support in some form for the adult family member. So to see if we can get engagement with mental health services, with drug and alcohol services, and also try and get housing on board in terms of rehousing the adult family member. And I know that can seem a bit contrary really to saying we're there to support our victim survivor and we're putting resources there into somebody who's perpetrating abuse, but actually that can be the most effective method in some of these cases of safeguarding that older person. Okay. So as I've said, I think I've touched on already that housing is difficult and housing for perpetrators is difficult as well. Because in terms of removing that adult family child from their home, they may have a right to remove them because they're the owner or it's their name on the tenancy. But actually removing that adult child will make them homeless. So as I say, we have had some success in bringing services on board that will seek housing for the adult family member. No, we tend to focus very much on care needs of our older people, but in the vast majority of cases, adult family abuse does involve a care need, but often that older person is providing care for an adult family member perpetrator. And in some cases, there's a codependency between the two. So the adult family member may be carrying out tasks for the older person, but the older person may be supporting them financially. So there's a codependency that develops there. Okay, so I want to just play you now a short audio. It's we're going to listen to the direct experiences of two older female victims talking about abuse perpetrated by their adult children. These the transcripts were taken from our research directly with our older victim survivors. They didn't want to voice them themselves, so the accounts are, let's say, accurate from the victim survivors' accounts, and they were voiced by actors for our podcast series. So I've got a couple of short clips on here, which I want to play for you now.
I felt trapped in my bedroom. I felt like I'd lost my home. I had to go into hospital for a major operation, and I gave her my credit card in case she needed anything. I told her to use the card because I knew she didn't have a lot of money. But that was a big mistake. When I came back home from the hospital, her wardrobe was full of new, expensive clothes. I checked my account and my money had gone right down. She'd been ordering everything. I was being billed for clothes from catalogues and mobile phones I knew nothing about. I just felt so disappointed. I confided in my other daughter, and she looked at my other accounts. My life savings had also been emptied. I'd been bled dry. My daughter was furious, and she reported her sister to the police. I was confused. Because I loved her, and she had provided care for me for years. But I was angry and hurt that she'd done this to me. She's still my child, even after what she put me through.
My son, he was a lovely child, a lovely little boy. But when he was a teenager, it changed. He started mixing with a bad crowd in the area, taking drugs, heroin. As an adult, he was living with me for a while. He had issues with housing, and I couldn't see him out on the streets. But it was bad. He was bad to live with, very aggressive. The only thing he didn't do was hit me. His father used to be abusive towards me, but he left when my son was young. I feel as if my son has taken over from my ex-husband. He's just like his father. He talks like his father. His behaviour is like his father. My son is such a bully. He's just so powerful. He's just drugged up all the time, and he's always swearing and screaming at me. One time during lockdown, he spat in my face and said, "Here, have COVID." He just doesn't respect me. I am quite ashamed of him, to be honest. But I do feel sorry for him, in a way, because he's my son. He's the only thing I've got, but unfortunately, I don't like him. I don't like the way he is with me. I know he has been taking my shopping money. But he says I am crazy and I must have lost it. And I know he has been selling my things. But he says I'm imagining it and I gave them away. He says I'm losing my marbles. Sometimes I think I am.
Okay, so as we've seen some with those two cases in isolation, really, there are some similarities, but also some quite big differences across the two. And in the first case, there was a lot of desire to protect her daughter, and a lot of love still there for her daughter. And in the second case with the adult son, I would say in that case, the behavior had been going on for longer. In the first case, the victim survivor did feel there was a bit of a reciprocal relationship with her daughter. So her daughter had provided care for her, and they had quite a loving relationship until the financial abuse really escalated. Whereas in the second case that we looked at, there'd always been a tension in the relationship, and it wasn't seen as very reciprocal. So there was very little that he'd done to support mum in any way. So you can see there was a lot more anger towards him, and actually not particularly liking him as a person. But in both cases, we can see that the older person is clearly identifying that what is happening is wrong. And I think the emotional impact of that abuse from a child really comes through. There was criminality detailed in both cases. So going back to the question earlier about pursuing justice options, both of them did take action. The first one through the daughter, really. The daughter was the second daughter was very much at the forefront of driving reports and criminal action against her sister. That did result in her sister having bail conditions at one point not to return to the property, and it was at that point that mum decided she wasn't going to have her daughter back in the house, and they didn't live together again after that. In the second case, we were in the process of seeking an occupation order when the adult son was offered hostel accommodation at that point, and he did decide to go. He'd refused any other offers of accommodation up till that point, but the process of going for the occupation order really did indicate to him that mum was quite serious about this now, and she was going to have him out of the property. So he left before the occupation order was finalised, and she did again put boundaries in place. So he was allowed to come and knock at the property at certain times of the day. He wasn't allowed access back into the property. And she did continue to have a level of contact with him, but with some boundaries in place. But in both of these cases, any steps really to stop the abuse really did involve that victim survivor coming to that point where they have to be prepared really to see their adult child homeless. So this is a complexity that we work with all the time, and it is really really difficult and takes quite a lot of time to get to that point really where they do feel willing to take that step. So we're going to just have a really brief look at a case study here. The case study, her name has been...
Sorry, Elize, just to interrupt, we've got a hand up here. I think someone's got a question regarding what we've just said.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you said that the adults must just be prepared to allow the son to go homeless, because I think I was involved in a case like that. In a situation whereby the mom is unwilling not unwilling, but it's difficult for her to allow to see her son go homeless. And this son, is just a pain in the life of this woman. How else can you help the woman? What else can you do to help?
Yeah, in terms of boundary setting, we do look at how they can protect finances, how they can create boundaries. Sometimes within the home, it is very difficult. If they're actually living in the home with them, it's difficult for them to establish boundaries, particularly if that adult family member is prepared to be aggressive and there's levels of fear there as well. So they're not prepared to challenge that behavior. In some cases where they're in local authority properties, we have explored with the local authority the moving on of the victim and seeking new accommodation for them. But again, that does meet that point where you're putting the adult child out of the home. So we do a lot of boundary setting with our older people when there's adult family abuse, where we're thinking ahead. So we're saying, okay, what are you prepared, and does sound quite negative really, but what are you prepared to put up with, and what is your breaking point? So at which point, as they overstepped that mark, so you at the moment you may be putting up with the shopping money going, you're putting up with musical night, you're putting up with them coming and going, bringing other people into the home night, but actually at what point, what level of behavior, and we do discuss some quite extreme levels of behavior, and so well, at which point is your cutoff point where you would say no, that's enough. So we look at that sort of future boundary setting, if that makes sense, at where their cutoffs are. So while we're supporting them, quite often those boundaries then are exceeded. So with one, it was her daughter was taking money, and she said, when I get down to, she'd had 90,000 in the bank, she said, when I'm down to 30, no more. I can't go any further than that. And she did get down to 30 and slightly below. And it was at those points that we were like, this was your cutoff. This was your boundary, your limit of what you were prepared to accept. And that did prompt her then into action at that point. So it is sort of trying to look ahead and say, well, actually, what do you see happening over the next couple of years? Where are your cutoff points for this? What are you willing to accept before you take action? And here's are the actions that you can take when we get to that point. And quite often there's a period of reflection and going over those and revisiting the behavior. But we always really enforce that this is an adult that's behaving like this. It may be their child, but it's an adult. How would they view this behavior if it was any other adult in their life? How would they view it if he was carrying that behavior out to another person? So we try and frame the adult child or grandchild as an adult who's making decisions on how they behave and has responsibility. So we do a lot of work around responsibilizing that adult child for their behavior. So as I say, it's not a quick fix solution. It can take months. The lady in the second audio we heard, it was well over 6 months, probably getting on for a year, wasn't it, David, until she got to the point where we were seeking that occupation order to remove him. And when we first suggested that, it was no way, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. But we tend to plant those ideas and then keep working towards getting to those stages where they do feel prepared and confident to pursue them. So it's a very slow process. So I hope that helps to some extent there.
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just
we do have a few more questions in the chat, but if you want to address them a bit later.
I'll address them now actually, because we can go a bit quicker through the case study, and I think it is more valuable if people have issues they want to raise.
Yeah, of course. So I'm currently working on a case where the ex of the citizen is the next of kin. The ex is threatening him with withholding the grandchildren from seeing him. If discharged, he will be living downstairs. The citizen is living with MS and is unable to use the stairs. The person who asked the question is due to meet the family also and asked what the advice would be.
So this is an intimate partner relationship, and the gentleman's due to be discharged from hospital. Have I took that right?
I think so. If the person is there and wants to just confirm that. Yeah.
No, I don't think they're
I
coming
think that
through.
is the case. Yeah.
If I've read, I hope I've interpreted that right. If I haven't, then please do email me afterwards and I'll come back to it. We did have a similar, quite similar situation where a gentleman, he was actually at the point where he wanted to leave, and we did use the stay in hospital to safely exit the property. So we did find him respite accommodation to come out into as he left us. He was a gentleman with Parkinson's and his health was really deteriorating at that point. So from the respite accommodation, we did then seek follow-on safe accommodation that he went into very happily. But again, that does rely on that individual being at that point where they want to leave the home. I'm not sure whether the gentleman in your case is whether that's part of his decision making. So as yeah, trying to think really whether I've answered that very effectively. I perhaps haven't. It depends again on the age of the family members that is trying to be restricted access to. If parents are restricting that access, then that's obviously something that we can't really overcome because there's obviously the parental rights there. If they're adult children, then sometimes we do actually contact adult children and help them to re-establish access with adult children that they've lost contact with through the abuse. So we do help to re-establish links, and I know the Red Cross will do work around that as well with trying to re-establish those family links. But okay, was there any others in there before I? David, I think you're on mute.
Apologies. Catherine was just also reflecting on that question and said also the fear it results in having to go into 24-hour care if the perpetrator is the main carer.
For the victim, for them leaving and going into care. Yeah, and that is tricky, particularly if you've got a victim that's leaving their home. We're trying to increase getting focus on the perpetrator so that the perpetrator leaves. We did have a case with dementia where the victim with dementia was removed and a deprivation of liberty was placed on her and she wasn't allowed to return to her home. We felt very strongly that actually the action in that case should have been taken against the perpetrator and he should have been removed from the home and she should have been allowed to return with a care package. We are advocating for that. Quite often the easy fix solution is almost seen as removing the victim. But as I've said earlier, finding that follow-on accommodation, we've had difficulty finding refuge spaces that will allow carers to come into, for example. So we may have accessible refuge places, but they're not happy about having carers come in to provide care in that refuge setting. So that's very complex. So I think really it is around building confidence with the victim then and looking at, particularly as care needs are increasing in later life, that's quite often a point where our victim survivors do decide to leave and make changes because they can see that as their health deteriorates and those care needs increase and disability is becoming more extreme as well, that they're going to be more dependent on that perpetrator, but also become more isolated by that perpetrator. So their ability to seek autonomous connections with community and service providers is going to be more restricted with that perpetrator taking a more extreme role. So I think with this victim, it is very sensitively working through that and saying, well, let's look at how your needs are increasing and what that looks like if you're staying living with that perpetrator in that situation, or if you're gaining some independence and we're bringing in really supportive care that's actually going to support you to have more autonomy and independence throughout the next X number of years, really. So it is confidence building really in that victim survivors. A lot of victim survivors, when they've had long-term coercive control, find it very hard to foresee a life without the perpetrator because their confidence in their own decision making has been so undermined they're actually having to make decisions and feel like they step into the abyss of being an independent adult away from that perpetrator is an absolutely terrifying step to take. So it is making sure there's those really good networks of support in place that build skills and build confidence in doing that. So knowing that that support is going to be in place long term and it's not going to drop off as soon as they've left that perpetrator again, it is really important. So in the case that you're looking at, advocacy services could probably play quite a key role in there as well, particularly if you've got an older person's organisation that's going to commit to work with that person for the longer term and build a relationship with them. So hoping that's helped. I'm going to move on to have a quick look at the case study now, because I'm aware that we haven't got a huge amount of time. So I've got a case up on the slide. This was a case that we worked with. We have changed her name. This was one of the oldest clients that we did work with. She was 93. She lived alone. She had quite a high level of independence. She had a hearing impairment, limited mobility, and she used a frame to get about within the home, and obviously when she was going out of the home with support. She did have a care package, so she had visits twice daily, and these helped her with washing, dressing, getting up and getting herself into bed. Her son was age 54 at the time, and he had long-term alcohol and substance misuse. And he would go off traveling for periods. He'd sleep rough for periods and disappear for months at a time out of her life. But there would be frequent phone calls with addresses where she was asked to post cash to. He would also appear from time to time. She kept a bedroom for him at the property, and he was verbally abusive to her regularly. He would ask her constantly for money, and on occasions he'd been physically abusive towards her. And we were working with her at a period where he was actually off traveling and out of her life, and during that period he did return to the property, and we got a phone call from the police to say that he'd been staying there for a couple of days, and he'd grabbed her by the front of her clothing. She'd tried to phone the doctors for him, and he'd grabbed the front of her clothing and pinned her up against the wall. And we have to remember, again, this is a lady who's 93, who does have frailty despite her good level of independence. She'd stated to the police that she was scared of him, but she was also worried about him. We went in to do a piece of work with her. He was on bail conditions at that point. She did describe that she was terrified. She had turned down the police offer of an IDVA because she didn't understand what an IDVA was. She thought she was being a nuisance and having another person round to the home. So we were able to sit with her with a nurse who was a really trusted person who played a key part in her role, the community nurse, and explained to her the role of an IDVA and what she could do to support her, and that actually that was something she had a right and would be really beneficial to her. So she did then accept the support of the IDVA. So again, a key thing around language and really being clear and explaining what people can do to you and removing some of the fear of new service providers coming in. In terms of good practice, the police did carry out a dash risk assessment with her. They also asked us for input into that dash post carrying it out. So we were able to contribute our knowledge, and they added that to the dash. They asked the district nurse to do the same as well, and the IDVA helps support that. So rather than us sit and have a full-blown dash taken with her, and we found like doing the dash with older clients is quite a lengthy period and involves quite a lot of delving and reframing things in a way that they understand it. So rather than spending hours and hours doing this with her, they did theirs, and then the other agencies had shorter conversation with her and input into that. The case was referred to Marek. I was going to throw this out for discussion, but I can see we've only got 10 minutes, so I think we'll carry on talking through it and give you the outcome actually, and then we can see if anybody sort of has some questions. So through the Marek process, she was represented by her IDVA then at that point. A local authority safeguarding officer who'd had contact with her was at the Marek, and her Dewis Choice support worker, which was myself at the time. We all attended the Marek, and we were shocked really that there was suggestion from another attendee at the Marek that it may be a good idea for Elizabeth to go into a care setting because that would be an ideal solution, and then she'd be safe, problem solved. We were quite shocked and appalled by this. Our feeling was that she wanted to stay in her own home. She had a really high level of independence, and that this wouldn't have been suggested as an option for a younger victim. So why would we see this as an appropriate response to an older victim? Elizabeth's son was convicted of assault, and he received a suspended sentence, and he had a fine as well. Unfortunately, Elizabeth did pay his fine. So again, we are sort of seeing a justice process that was quite effective in that it went through and it did sanction him, but then the sanction really did expand to Elizabeth as well because she paid the fine for him. So we put in a place a plan that was very simple, but one that was acceptable to her. She clearly stated that if he came to her house, she would answer the door to him and that she wanted to still support him. So putting in a plan where she had no contact with him whatsoever and refused it just wasn't feasible. So it had to be something that worked for her. So she did agree to keep her door locked and not open it. She was adamant she wanted to give him small amounts of money still. So we found a way that she could do this by keeping a small amount of cash in the home that she'd put in an envelope, and she'd give him it through the door. So then he would go away, he'd come and he got what he wanted, but it was safe contact. And these were small amounts that she kept in the home. So there was no more for him to, access and take. Elizabeth used a small pendant alarm in case she had falls, and the call centre were informed of the abuse, and a plan put in place that if the alarm was triggered, that they would also request a police response as well as a health response, and that if her son was to answer the call and say everything's fine, mum's up, and you don't need to come out, that they would ignore that and override it. A plan was formed with the carers that were coming in as well. So they were aware of the abuse, and they were shown sort of how to identify any behaviours and raise concerns really quickly. Elizabeth's neighbours were also aware of John's behaviour. They'd known, that he'd been like this for years, and she agreed for conversations to be had with them where they were empowered to call the police. So if they saw him at the property and he was refusing to leave, and he did do that on one occasion where I was just leaving after a visit, actually sitting in the car, and he was banging on the door and banging on the windows, and we saw neighbours' doors opening. And actually on that occasion, the lollipop lady came running up the road with a lollipop stick. So there was quite a big community response to this. But the neighbours were warned not to challenge his behaviour, that they report it to the police, but not challenge. So she did continue to have regular contact as well with a choice support worker for an extended period. So she'd have calls weekly to begin with, and then these went out gradually to monthly as well, so that we could keep a bit of an eye on it with her on what was happening. So although the decision for her to continue to give him money seems like an unwise decision, we have to respect that she had full capacity in her decision making and the right to make decisions that we may not agree with or feel wise. So it is, as I say, important to take all these things into balance actually, and find an effective way of supporting somebody where they actually feel you're listening to what they need and what they're saying that they want in those occasions, but finding a safe way for her to do what she was quite determined to do. So I've just got one more slide really, and these are some key tips, and a lot of them we've covered in the discussion already, really, and this is around which we had a discussion with the attendee who asked a question a moment ago, is around being really direct in addressing any self-blame that the older victim survivor expresses. It's not uncommon for them to really take on responsibility for their adult family members' behaviour. So it's really clear to responsibilise that adult family member as an adult, no longer as they might be their child, their grandchild, but they're not a child. They're an adult operating in, you know, an adult world and making autonomous decisions. So really responsibilising that behaviour with the older person. It's also adopting the language that the older survivor uses to describe the abuse while still making it clear that that person is responsible. So sometimes our victim survivors will use the language of abuse, domestic abuse. Other times they'll use language like bullying, terms like bullying, and if they use the term bullying, we will use the term bullying with them also, so it's language that they're comfortable with. They will also tend to use more descriptive language around behaviours as well. So we'll talk about the behaviours then as well, rather than sort of labelling things as domestic abuse. So there's no minimising the abuse within those behaviours, and obviously making clear that those behaviours are really wrong, but using the language that person's comfortable with. We challenge attempts to excuse some particularly controlling behaviours based on the abuser's support needs or vulnerabilities. So yes, they may have mental health needs, yes, they may have substance use needs, but actually their decisions to engage with services are their decisions, whether they engage or they choose to disengage. So they have a responsibility to engage with services and address those if they are saying that that is what's beneath their abusive behaviour. And I say exploring boundaries and boundary setting can be really effective. So we may not get an immediate change or boundary put in place, but looking at those boundaries and how far they're willing to go. For example, if that person took cash from the house, they may be willing to overlook that. But if they took their bank card, if they started drawing out large sums of money, then actually that might be the point where they decide that they're willing to report that behaviour. But also looking at other people that can report that behaviour on their behalf as well. So if they don't feel able to do that directly, are they happy for that to be taken out of their hands and somebody else to report? I can see we've literally got 1 minute to go. So the slides will be available. I have forwarded them over in PDF. There are films and podcasts available on our website, which you'll see links to on the slides, and also links to our research publications. Some of them are behind a paywall, but if you get to the point where you can't access them, please do get in touch with us. Again, there's some contact details on the slide, and we'll be able to send you a pre-print, pre-production copy of those out, so you will be able to access them. Okay, so I'm aware we've come to the end of the session, but we are around, myself and David, so if there are any other questions and people are willing to sort of be around for a few minutes, then we're happy to stay and answer those. I don't know if there's anything significant popping up in the chat, David, that you wanted to...
No, people kind of agreeing with what you're saying. Kathleen has said it is very challenging when you can only be involved for a short period of time to investigate safeguarding, and little time to build a trusting relationship.
Yeah, and I think we are fortunate in that we've had to fight really for our resources to keep going to offer this long-term service, and I think we are aware that a lot of services and organisations can't do that longevity of support. That is quite often why referrals come into us. We will see referrals where the safeguarding is about to be closed, but there's a recognition that the situation's still bubbling away, or there's some recovery support needed, so they'll come in to us because they know they can stay with us for the longer term. So it is really capitalizing on any services you've got in your area that can do that. So it's using your domestic abuse services where possible, but also looking at, we've had some really good help and support with the Red Cross in particular, with particularly if there's cases with dementia. Age UK, we link in with Age Cymru here in Wales for those. We have community connector services in some areas that will help somebody get re-engaged with groups and reconnect with their community, which again can provide a really valuable safety net, both in terms of increasing independence, but also increasing those opportunities to disclose and help seek. So anything that we can draw on to get people more connected and get regular contact. If we've got befriending services, any of those services that we can draw on that are going to continue to have a bit more longer term contact with the older victim survivor, and can also be there in a position to flag up then if we've got further ongoing abuse and concerns, or if they see a situation that's escalating, so they can flag it back into safeguarding services.
Yeah, I think just to build on that as well, I think it really highlights for ourselves, even though we are fortunate enough to support individuals for such a long period of time, even we discover and find out that we're not getting disclosures until maybe 2-3 months into building that relationship. So I can really respect how hard it must be for those who don't have that period of time.
Yeah. I mean, we have sort of months after beginning to support people when they've had quite intensive risk assessments and a lot of conversations, suddenly information will come out, particularly with the intimate partner group, around instances of sexual abuse that they've experienced, it's took a long time to build up the courage to speak about those. It's really important as practitioners that we're open in having these conversations with older victim survivors as well, and that we keep going back and revisiting and asking, because we're not always going to have that information when somebody first comes into support with us. And we've had really significant disclosures months down the line that actually we said, well, that case was risk assessed before coming into us. It was a standard to medium on the risk assessment. We've now seen so much information come through that meant that actually at that point where that case was risk assessed, it was really very high risk and should have gone through to MARIC. So it is important on ensuring those people have got routes to keep having ongoing discussions with people who can draw these things out and flag them up. Okay, I think it's gone quite quiet now. I am going to stop the recording. I think I just press the cross and it goes. So hopefully that recording will download and be fine. We have done it a few times before, haven't we? And it's been okay. Okay.
Hi, Elize. Thank you so much.
Hi.
That was a great session. I was dipping in and out and just making sure that people could get in. I have, for those that are still with us, I have shared with the feedback form. If you could please take some time to fill that out. It's really helpful for us to have your feedback, because as a partnership, when we put these weeks together, we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all our workforce in social work and social care across Manchester. So it's really helpful to know what sort of topics and themes are going on the ground floor and on the front line. So yeah, if you can take some time, it only takes a minute, if you can fill it out, and then we can pull the feedback of the whole week together, and we'll share the feedback with yourself, Elize, and
that's
David.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, and any questions that arise after, we do welcome contact from people, or if anything comes into you and you want to pass it on to us, then we'll be happy to respond.
Brilliant, that's great, that's no problem. So I have got the slides, and you've sent me over some information, haven't you, Elize? So once I've got that together, I will email that out to those that registered.
Lovely, thank you, and thank you for asking us along, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of Safeguarding Adults Week.
Yeah, we've got plenty more coming up, so yeah, we're going to be busy bees this week. But yeah, thanks so much, it was a great session, and I can see from the comments and from the interactions that everyone's got something from it and found it really helpful in their practice. So thanks again to yourself and to David. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much. Speak to you soon. Take care.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.